All right, so now we have made it to our final dimension for Buddhism, which is society. So we just have a couple things to go over to talk about for this slide. The first one is that in terms of how Buddhism is set up as a society, there is a close connection between the Sangha and the community. So remember, the Sangha refers to the community of monks and nuns. So again, this can mean sort of the global community of monks and nuns, and especially sort of your local monks and nuns. So if you live near a temple or a monastery, these are your experts. These are your local experts in Buddhism. So that's the Sangha. And community here, what I mean by that is really the lay people in Buddhism, everyone else, right? Everyone else who's not within a leadership position. And those two aspects of Buddhist society, they are very well connected to each other. They are very well integrated. So Buddhism does have monks and nuns, as we've mentioned before. And if you have decided that this is the appropriate lifetime for you to become a monk or a nun, you are dedicating yourself fully to enlightenment, to achieving enlightenment. And you are giving up other aspects of life, right? You're giving up having a family, you're giving up having a job, having a career. So in order to be able to focus on your practice, you rely on that community, right? The community is there to step up and help you. Community members greatly respect monks and nuns, so they want to do what they can to help them. They want to, they donate money to the monastery to feed them and clothe them and take care of them. They also donate their time and their energy. They come and help cook meals for the monks and nuns. They come and help maintain the monastery and the temple, so that if you're a monk or a nun, you don't have to be bothered by all those million day-to-day worries and stresses that the rest of us have. That person really is free to completely focus on their path. Not that that's an easy lifestyle, right? That's quite difficult to do, to meditate all day, study the scriptures, focus on overcoming attachment. So the community wants to help them and wants to relieve any other stress or burden that they have. So the Sangha and the community, the Buddhist community, are very strongly connected to each other. They rely on each other. And the community, also needs their Sangha because that's how they learn more about Buddhism, right? Those are their local teachers, their local experts. So they rely on them to progress in their path however far they can while they're still in this world, while they're still, getting married and having families and having jobs and all that sort of stuff. Buddhism also has priests, so there are also Buddhist priests. In some Mahayana traditions, there's not necessarily monks and nuns. One of the other major differences between Mahayana Buddhism and Theravadan Buddhism is that many, but not all, Mahayana denominations actually come to reject the ideal of the Sangha. They believe that you don't have to become a monk or a nun to achieve enlightenment. So many Mahayana teachings focus on the ability for anyone to achieve enlightenment. Even if you are married and you have a job and you have a family, you can learn to be in the world but not attached to the world. And they see that actually as the greater challenge. That it's sort of too easy. It's a shortcut to literally detach yourself from the world to overcome attachment. They say the greater challenge of the Buddhist path is to remain in the world and then also find attachment. And they see that as morally better because then you are still helping people in your community. You're helping your loved ones. So you can, through your own process, help others to also come closer to enlightenment. So for those traditions, they have a priest and not a monk or a nun. And the role of the priest is really to run a temple in terms of, giving Dharma talks, giving meditation guidance, running the temple, running the certain rituals, funeral ceremonies, things like that are done, and giving the community a place to come together to learn more about Buddhism together as a community. So those are sort of the leadership roles and how Buddhism is ordered as a society. Then the last thing that I have here is just sort of a modern movement within Buddhism, which is called socially engaged Buddhism. And this starts with a man named Thich Nhat Hanh. So that's the next word there. That's the name of a Buddhist monk. He's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. He's probably the second most famous Buddhist in the world behind the Dalai Lama. If you're interested in learning more about Buddhism, I would definitely start with some of the books written by Thich Nhat Hanh. He has written many, many books about Buddhism for a Western audience. So his books are very understandable, they're very approachable if you weren't raised in a Buddhist country or a Buddhist culture. So anyway, socially engaged Buddhism starts to kind of reject this idea that if you're a monk or a nun, you should detach yourself from society, right? It means that you are dedicating yourself to your personal path, to achieving nirvana, to achieving enlightenment, and you don't have much involvement in society other than providing guidance and rituals and information to those who are seeking you out, to those Buddhist community members who want to learn more about Buddhism and progress in their path. So there's a group of monks who start to reject this idea, and they start to say, you know what, we do have a lot of wisdom. We do have a lot of benefit, or we've gained a lot of benefit from our progress in our path. And so instead of using that benefit just for ourselves, we should be using that patience, that compassion, that wisdom that we have gained through our spiritual practice. We should be using that to help the community. So it starts with Thich Nhat Hanh, and it starts as a protest movement against the Vietnam War. So Thich Nhat Hanh was a monk during the Vietnam War, and was very much opposed to the war itself, just opposed to the continued violence that was happening in his country. So some of the first acts of socially engaged Buddhism were the self-immolation of Buddhist monks in Vietnam. Many of you have probably heard of this before, or you remember seeing the image of this. Once you've seen a picture of this happening, you'll never forget it. But these monks, and this was part of the general movement Thich Nhat Hanh was a part of, but he didn't participate in this because he's still alive, he's still around. So these Buddhist monks would go into very crowded intersections in Vietnam. They would sit down in the middle of the intersection, and they would light themselves on fire and kill themselves. They would do this in a state of meditation, so they actually wouldn't scream, they wouldn't react, they wouldn't do anything. But this was a very powerful and visible statement of protest that these Buddhist monks interpreted as, I'm not harming anyone. I'm only harming myself, but hopefully this will help end the suffering of others. I'm willing to, take on whatever consequences, karmic consequences this has, in order to maybe draw the world's attention to what's happening here and prevent further violence and further injury towards other people. So this is how it starts, but it has progressed, and it's a movement that continues today in many different countries around the world, many different Buddhist cultures, and it's just a movement of monks and nuns who say, you know what, we have a responsibility to help our community. So when there are social injustices in our country or in our community, we are going to get involved. And that actually doesn't hinder us on our path to detachment. That helps us in our path, because this is acting on the compassion that we have for others. So the picture behind me is from the country of Burma or Myanmar. And this was a place where the Buddhist monks in that country took a very active role in overthrowing the dictatorship in that country, which was overthrown just a couple years ago. So this was a pretty recent movement. The Buddhist monks used sort of their status and their power in society to speak out against the government when the regular people couldn't. Normal, lay people, community members were afraid of, retaliation from the government, but the Buddhist monks were so respected in society that they were able to have a louder voice. They were able to do that with less fear of reprisal. There definitely was several instances of harm towards the monks, but they sort of had more of a protected status in society. So the monks in Burma are another example of socially engaged Buddhism. And there's another famous example that occurred in Thailand several years ago, that there was a demolition. There was vast deforestation. A lot of the forests in Thailand were being cut down for lumber and things like that. And many of the Buddhist monks were opposed to this, or at least the extent that it had gone to, because they oftentimes lived in those forests. They would be associated with a certain temple or monastery, but for part of the year, they would actually go into the forest and they would live there. They would just bring a mat and some supplies, and they would go out for these long meditative retreats by themselves in the forest. So they wanted to protect these forests. They thought they were very important for the spiritual development of monks in Thailand. So what they did is they actually went around these forests and they ordained every tree as a monk. So the same ceremony that monks and nuns go through in order to become a monk or a nun, they performed those same ceremonies on the actual trees. And then when they were finished, they tied an orange ribbon around the trees. So it's kind of symbolically like the tree was taking on the robe. Because in Thailand, monks and nuns wear orange robes. So the trees themselves had taken on the robe. So these trees, and this was, they did this to thousands and thousands of trees to save these entire forests. So they did that. And then the people who worked for the logging companies, they were also Thai Buddhists. And because the monks had done this, they did not feel comfortable in any way cutting down these trees, because that felt, blasphemous. That felt sacrilegious to them. They said, I can't cut down these trees because they're actually monks now. This is now a sacred forest because each one of these trees has gone through that ceremony. So Buddhist monks in Thailand were actually able to save entire forests this way. And you can still go to Thailand and you can see the trees with the orange ribbons tied around them. And that shows you that tree has been ordained as a monk. So those are just some of the sort of the campaigns and movements, but it's sort of a general, it's a general or global movement that sort of takes on this idea of actually getting involved in the community, working towards social justice, using the insight and the knowledge and the compassion that monks and nuns have gained in order to help their society, instead of just, becoming completely removed from that community. Okay, so that's all we have for society. That's our last dimension for Buddhism. I hope you've enjoyed learning about this tradition. And when we come back, we're going to start on Judaism. So we're going to kind of jump to a very different type of religious tradition. We're going to start looking at our great Western monotheisms.